Welcome to the Deep Dive, the shortcut to being the most informed person in the room.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're tackling a big one. Really big. Friedrich Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality. It's demanding, systematic, and honestly pretty transformative stuff.
Absolutely. We're diving deep into the foundations, the invisible rules we use to judge ourselves, judge others.
So what's the mission today?
Okay, our goal is a systematic walkthrough. We want to unpack his three core arguments, what he called his three decisive preliminary studies by a psychologist for a revaluation of values.
A revaluation of values. That sounds intense.
It is. He's not asking where morality should come from. He's obsessed with where it actually did come from, its history, and why that history still grips our thinking today.
Right, because if you ask most people, where does morality come from, what do they say? God, usually.
Or maybe some kind of natural evolutionary thing towards cooperation.
Yeah, exactly. But Nietzsche throws both of those out.
Completely. His diagnosis right off the bat is pretty chilling. He sees morality as this system built on historical errors that are now baked into how we think, how we feel, how we live.
He calls it the great symbol of our profound ignorance of ourselves and the world. That's quite a statement.
It really is. And for Nietzsche, this isn't some harmless mistake. He sees morality as, dangerous, menacing even.
Why dangerous?
Because he fears this system, the one that values comfort, fitting in, the herd mentality, makes the present live at the expense of the future. It actually threatens our potential as a species, our highest potential and splendor, as he puts it.
So we're settling, choosing mediocrity over potential because of this inherited morality.
That's his core worry, yeah. It sets the stage for everything else.
Okay, so before he dives into the actual history, he needs to clear the ground first, right? Critique the assumptions that block us from seeing this history.
Exactly. He lays these out, especially in the gay science, as the 4 errors modern people make when thinking about themselves. These are like the blind spots.
What are they?
Well, first, we see ourselves incompletely. We kind of ignore the huge, often dark history of our own instincts, pretend it's not there.
Okay, denial. What's second?
Second, we give ourselves fictitious attributes, things that aren't real. The big one here is the idea of a completely unbiased, free-willing self, the autonomous subject.
The soul or the subject that somehow stands apart from the body and its drives.
Precisely. Third error. We put ourselves in a false rank compared to animals and nature. We assume we're inherently superior, maybe spiritually unique, totally separate from biology.
We were above it all.
Right. And the fourth error, this is the operational one, maybe the most important for the genealogy. We invent new lists of what's good, and then, this is crucial, we accept them as eternal, unconditional, universal truths. We totally forget where they came from, their specific, often violent origins.
So we make up rules and then pretend they've always been there, handed down from on high.
You got it. And if you buy into these errors, Nietzsche argues, you realize the goal of modern culture isn't really enlightenment or anything grand, it's domestication.
Domestication. Like house pets.
That's exactly his analogy. He says the aim got corrupted, twisted into trying to breed a tame and civilized animal, a household pet, out of the beast of prey man.
Wow. So that leads to the famous complaint then about becoming.
More comfortable, more mediocre, more indifferent, more Chinese, more Christian. Yes.
That phrase, more Chinese, it sounds a bit jarring today. What did he mean by that in his context?
Yeah, it definitely lands differently now. For Nietzsche, in his time, it symbolized a kind of cultural stagnation, a vast, ancient civilization focused on stability, conformity, comfort. The opposite of the dynamic, creative, maybe dangerous vitality he valued.
Okay, so it's about conformity versus vitality.
Right. And this frustration, this critique of modern tameness leads him straight into conflict with the very people who were trying to do genealogy before him, the English kind of moral genealogists. He names Paul Ray, Herbert Spencer.
Okay, so why the beef? He's basically doing what they were trying to do, isn't he? A history of morals.
He thinks they failed completely. Miserably. He accuses them of having no real historical sense. They just rely on merely modern experience, their own democratic sensibilities.
They lack the instinct for history, he says.
Yeah. And their biggest mistake, projecting modern values backward in time, they just assume that good originally meant useful, specifically useful to the community.
The idea that unselfish acts were useful, so people started calling them good. The utilitarian argument.
That's the one. They think good started with unegoistic actions because those helped the group survive.
But Nietzsche spots a problem with that logic, doesn't he?
A huge one. Yes, okay. If being unselfish was so useful all the time, why would people ever forget that it was useful? Why would the memory fade?
Right. Wouldn't constant usefulness just reinforce the memory that it's useful, not transform it into some mystical good?
Exactly. Constant utility should burn it into memory, not allow it to become this sacred, eternal value completely detached from its practical origin. The English guys, he thinks, just aren't explaining the psychological shift. They're just guessing, hypothesis mongering into the blue, based on what feels right to them now.
Wishful thinking, basically.
Pretty much. And that's why he insists his method needs to be gray.
Gray. What does gray represent?
Gray means documentation, facts, history. That which can be documented, which can actually be confirmed and has actually existed. He wants a real history of morality, not just philosophical daydreaming.
And he uses philology, right? The history of words.
Heavily. Language change is key for him. How did the meaning of words like good actually shift over time? That's evidence. That's gray. It's not blue sky speculation.
Okay, so this focus on real history, on language, leads us directly into his first essay, The Big Clash, Good and Bad versus Good and Evil.
Yes. Master morality versus slave morality. This is where he asks, under what conditions did humans first start making these value judgments? What did they originally mean?
He sets it up with a kind of thought experiment, doesn't he? A society split in two.
Yeah, imagine a group of dominant masters, warriors, conquerors, politically powerful, and then a subordinate group, the slaves, the conquered, the weak.
And the master morality comes first. It's defined by the rulers, the nobles. What's their mindset like?
It's spontaneous,
Yeah.
active, fundamentally self-affirming. They don't need to reflect much or justify themselves. Why would they? They're living life fully physical exuberance, he calls it. Brawling, hunting, drinking, taking risks.
Living large.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And they look at themselves, at their way of life, and they just say, this is good.
And good for them has nothing to do with being nice or selfless.
Absolutely nothing. It's rooted in what he calls the pathos of nobility and distance. Good means noble, powerful, high status, proud. It refers to their own superior state of being, their soul.
So good equals us. What about bad?
Bad is almost an afterthought, a secondary thing. It's just what they call the others, the weak, the common, the low rank, the despicable. Anyone incapable of living like them.
So the first value system is just good-bad, meaning noble, common, strong, weak, based purely on rank and power, an affirmation of themselves.
Exactly. It's self-referential.
Okay, that distinction, good-bad tied to rank, is so important because the next step is what he calls the slave revolt in morality, this huge inversion.
One of the most pivotal moments in human psychology, according to Nietzsche. The slaves, they're weak, oppressed. They can't just spontaneously affirm themselves like the masters. They don't have the power.
So they're stuck in a reactive state.
Yes. They develop ressentiment. It's more than just resentment. It's this festering, poisonous feeling that builds up when you can't act, can't retaliate directly. Your desire for revenge gets bottled up, turns inward, and eventually it gets creative, imaginative.
Revenge taken in the imagination. How does that change everything? How does it flip the moral world upside down?
It's the great reversal. Since they're powerless against the masters, the ones the masters call good, they invert the entire value system. They invent a new concept, evil.
Ah, okay, so evil is new.
Brand new. And who is evil? The masters. Their strength, their power, their lifestyle, everything the masters celebrated as good is now redefined by the slaves as wicked, cruel, sinful, damned.
So the masters become the definition of evil, and then the slaves define their own goodness simply by not being like the masters.
Exactly. Slave goodness just means not evil. It's the opposite of the master. Humility, patience, obedience, enduring suffering. Things the masters despised.
Well, wait, isn't that just making a virtue out of necessity? They have to be humble because they're weak.
Precisely. That's the insidious psychological trick, the self-deception. They take their actual weakness, their impotence, their inability to hit back, and they reframe it. They stylize it into a voluntary moral achievement. A choice.
I choose to be meek, I choose to turn the other cheek.
Right. But to make that believable, even to themselves, they need a philosophical crutch, don't they?
What's the crutch?
They need the invention of free will. And the idea of an unbiased subject or self that stands behind actions and makes choices.
How does that help?
Well, if the subject is free and separate from its strength or weakness, then the weak person can say, look, I could have been vengeful like those evil masters, but I freely chose to be humble and forgiving instead. It lets them claim moral superiority for what is, in reality, just their powerlessness.
It masks the impotence, gives it a moral gloss. Wow.
It's a powerful mechanism for self-preservation and psychic revenge.
Nietzsche uses some pretty strong language for the masters who got overthrown by this, doesn't he? The beasts of prey, the blonde beast. He mentions Romans, Arabs, Germanic nobles. Is he glorifying barbarism here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's where people often get tripped up. It's crucial to remember he's doing psychology and history here, not writing a political manifesto.
Okay, so he's describing, not prescribing.
Right. He sees this blonde beast, which isn't necessarily about literal hair color, more about a type as expressing a certain kind of overflowing health, instinct, vitality. It's terrifying, yes, but it's also a source of creative power. The tragedy for him is that this vitality, this active force, got wrecked and overpowered by the reactive force of ressentiment.
So the historical result is the common people won. Their morality took over.
That's his diagnosis. Leading to the modern Europe, he wasn't too fond of prioritizing safety, comfort, herd values over creative struggle, and, well, greatness. He sees this slave morality as a kind of subtle poison that spread everywhere, almost unstoppable.
So the whole foundation of our modern good and evil is based on this ancient psychic revenge, not on noble self-affirmation. That's a heavy thought.
It is, and it perfectly sets up the second essay. If the weak invented evil and flipped morality, how did this new system get so deeply embedded? How did it get written onto our souls? That leads us to guilt, bad conscience, and punishment.
Okay, second essay. Where does he start?
He starts with a really fundamental problem for any society, or even nature itself. How do you breed an animal that can promise? A creature that can remember its own will over time and actually bind itself to the future.
Why is promising so important?
Think about it. If you can't rely on someone to remember what they said, to keep their word, how can you have contracts, trade, society, any kind of reliable future? You need predictability. You need memory.
Okay, so how do you make humans who are naturally forgetful remember their promises? How do you make them responsible?
Well, Nietzsche says it wasn't gentle persuasion, not at all. It required pretty harsh methods, the morality of custom, the social straitjacket. Basically, society had to work violently against our natural tendency to forget.
Violently.
To make ideas stick, to make them ineradicable. He says they had to be burnt in. He uses really graphic imagery here. Blood, torture, sacrifice, painful rituals, mnemonics of pain. Suffering is the great teacher, the tool that engraves memory onto the body and mind.
That's grim. A disturbing foundation for civilization. Is there an upside to this brutal process?
There is an achievement, yes. He calls it the sovereign individual. This is the person who has finally mastered this process. They're autonomous, they've moved beyond just blind custom, they possess a strong, reliable will, they can promise.
Okay.
And this sovereign individual has a proud consciousness of responsibility. Verantwortlichkeit is the German. And this feeling, this mastery of their own will and memory, this is what they call their conscience.
So conscience originally is about being reliable, being able to stand by your word, the pride of being dependable.
In this initial stage, yes, it's the mark of the fully developed promise-keeping animal.
But Nietzsche being Nietzsche, he can't leave it there. If this person has a conscience, and part of that involves feeling guilty if they fail, where does that feeling of guilt come from?
Ah, yes. This is maybe one of the most explosive parts of the book, his historical, philological bombshell. He argues that the core moral concept of Guiltschuld in German comes directly from the very mundane, very material concept of Debtsschulden.
Guilt comes from debt, like financial debt.
Exactly. From the sphere of legal obligations, the basic relationship between a buyer and a seller, a creditor and a debtor. Our deep moral sense of guilt originates in the account books.
How does that work? What's the connection?
The oldest link is simple. If you owe a debt and can't pay it back with money or goods, you pay it back with something else. You give the creditor the right to inflict pain on you.
So punishment is payment.
Yes. And here's the kicker. Nietzsche claims that for the creditor, the injured party, making the debtor suffer was actually a source of pleasure, a kind of compensation, an extraordinary counterpleasure for the damage or loss they suffered.
Wow. So punishment wasn't originally about justice or fixing the person. It was about the creditor getting satisfaction through the debtor's pain.
That's his claim. It highlights how cruelty, for the ancients, wasn't something shameful. It was part of the festive joy. He even says punishment had strong festive features. Life was maybe more cheerful, in a way, when people weren't embarrassed by their own capacity for cruelty. The creditor got their pound of flesh, quite literally sometimes, as compensation.
Okay, that explains a kind of external system of debt and punishment. But what about the internal feeling, the bad conscience? That feeling of self-torment, beating yourself up inside. Where did that come from?
That's the next big step. Bad conscience, he says, originated as a serious illness. It happened when humanity, specifically the strong, free-roaming, aggressive type, was suddenly forced into the tight confines of society and peace, when the state was formed.
So civilization itself made us sick.
In a way, yes. He stresses this wasn't gradual. It was a sudden, violent breach, a leap, a compulsion. Think of those blonde beasts of prey again, the master types. They impose order, create a state through terrible tyranny, forcing everyone, including eventually themselves, into a structured, peaceful society.
Okay, so the strong are now stuck inside the walls of society. They
Yeah.
can't just go out and conquer or fight anymore. What happens to all that aggressive energy, the will to power?
It gets blocked, dammed up. It has nowhere to go externally, so it gets turned inward, redirected against the self.
Mm.
This internalization of aggression, of cruelty, invents the human inner world, the soul, as we think of it. The inner landscape expanded and extended itself, he says, precisely because the external outlets were blocked.
And this turning inward is the bad conscience.
Yes. The active bad conscience. It's a secret self-harm, an artist's cruelty turned against one's own animal nature. We start using memory, reason, and that sense of responsibility developed earlier to punish ourselves.
So this self-torture is a sickness, a kind of psychic self-mutilation born from civilization. Yet Nietzsche finds something productive in it too. That seems paradoxical.
Deeply paradoxical. He acknowledges it's an insidious illness, a sickness of himself, but he also sees it as the very thing that made humans. Well, interesting. It created depth, tension, complexity. He calls bad conscience the true womb of ideal and imaginative events.
So our inner turmoil, our self-conflict, is what makes us capable of art, ideals, maybe even greatness? We become a bridge, a great promise because of this sickness.
That's the tension he explores. It's deeply problematic, but also strangely fertile ground.
Okay, let's connect this back. We have the slave revolt creating evil, and now we have bad conscience internalizing cruelty as self-torment. How does the idea of debt fit back into this, especially with religion?
It reaches its peak, its most monstrous form in Christianity, according to Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Over time, as society gets more stable, the debt isn't just owed to other people anymore. It gets projected upward, first to the ancestors, the founders of the tribe,
Okay.
and eventually to the ultimate ancestor, God. God becomes the ultimate creditor, the one to whom we owe an infinite, unpayable debt simply for existing.
An unpayable debt. That sounds terrifying.
It leads to a monstrous level of sublime feeling and guilt, an overwhelming sense of inadequacy, of sinfulness facing this cosmic creditor. The prospect of eternal punishment for failing to repay becomes a central psychological driver. Man is trapped in infinite guilt.
And Christianity's solution to this crushing infinite debt.
That, for Nietzsche, is its stroke of terrible genius, the ultimate psychological trick. God sacrificing himself for man's debt, none other than God paying himself back.
God pays God to forgive humanity's debt to God.
Exactly. It offers immense relief, a way out of the unbearable guilt. But, and this is the crucial point for Nietzsche, it simultaneously takes the concepts of debt and guilt and turns them into the ultimate instrument of torture. It provides the already suffering person of bad conscience with the perfect framework to maximize their self-cruelty, to really wallow in their own supposed wickedness.
So religion takes the raw animal sickness of bad conscience and gives it a divine justification, making the self-torture even more profound.
Precisely. That's the genealogy of our inner torment. A chain reaction starting with masters and slaves, moving through debt and punishment, and culminating in religious guilt.
Which brings us to the third essay. We've seen the origins of the values and the guilt. Now the question is, what's the point of it all? What do ascetic ideals mean? If our civilization is built on this sickness, what's the ultimate goal or meaning it offers?
Right. The third essay zooms in on the figure who becomes the expert in managing all this suffering and guilt, the ascetic priest.
Who is this figure? Not necessarily the rulers.
No, not the political masters. Think more like the spiritual guides, the shamans, the priests, the philosophers later on. They stand out because of their extreme focus on purity, abstinence, self-denial, asceticism. They become the doctors for the sick herd, the guides for the guilt-ridden population.
And what's their main function? How do they manage the suffering?
Their masterstroke is interpretation. They take that vague, painful, animal feeling of bad conscience, that self-attack we talked about, and they give it a new meaning. They reinterpret it as sin.
Ah, So bad conscience becomes sin. How does that change things?
Well, imagine the suffering slave, plagued by weakness and that internal gnawing feeling. They ask, why me? If I'm trying to be good, humble, patient, why do I still suffer so much?
A perfectly reasonable question. The biological answer would be.
Because you're physiologically weak, maybe degenerating. But the priest doesn't give a biological answer. He gives a moral one.
What's the moral diagnosis?
You yourself alone are to blame for it. You yourself alone are to blame for yourself. It's your fault. You are a sinner.
Wow. That's ingenious. In a dark way. How does that help the sufferer?
It redirects their resentiment. Remember how it was originally aimed outward at the masters? The priest cleverly turns it completely inward. You stop blaming fate or the strong or the world. You blame yourself. You internalize the blame entirely. You become the sinner.
And the cure for this self-inflicted sin.
The ascetic ideal itself, the whole package. Self-denial, fasting, chastity, poverty, self-flagellation, constant striving for purity, a life lived against natural impulse.
Which looks like a massive contradiction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Life operating against life, as Nietzsche puts it.
Yeah.
A will completely turned against itself. How can life produce an ideal that denies life?
It seems utterly contradictory, yes. Why would the will to power, this fundamental drive for life and strength, generate an ideal based on denying life? Nietzsche says this is just a psychological misunderstanding. It only looks like a contradiction.
Okay, so what's really going on? How is it not life against life?
If you look at it physiologically, psychologically, he argues the ascetic ideal is actually a trick for the preservation of life.
A trick. How does denying life preserve life? That sounds like the core puzzle.
It comes from the protective and healing instincts of a degenerating life. It's a symptom of the sickliness of the type of man who has lived up till now. Think about it. Humanity, suffering, feeling meaningless, might just give up, fall into despair, maybe even suicidal nihilism.
Okay, the abyss of meaninglessness.
The ascetic ideal steps into that void. It gives suffering humanity something absolutely crucial. A meaning, a goal, a purpose, even if that purpose is self-denial and striving against life itself.
So by inventing a goal, get closer to God, achieve purity, overcome sin, it prevents total existential collapse.
Exactly. It successfully shut the door on suicidal nihilism for thousands of years. People, Nietzsche thinks, would rather suffer with a meaning, any meaning, even a life-denying one, than suffer meaninglessly. The ascetic ideal provided that meaning, that direction for the will.
It channeled the self-destructive energy of the bad conscience into a structured pursuit.
Yes. It managed the sickness, organized it, gave it a narrative, and in doing so, paradoxically, helped preserve the species through its sickness.
This ideal didn't just dominate religion, did it? Nietzsche points out that philosophers have always had a soft spot for asceticism too. Why is that?
Yeah, he notes this historical, philosophical partiality for asceticism. Philosophers often seem irritated by the body, by sensuality, by chaos. They're drawn to the quiet, the focus, the denial of the ascetic life.
Seems natural for deep thinkers.
But Nietzsche, typically, strips away the moral halo. He says the philosopher's chastity, their denial, isn't really about virtue or moral self-control. It's instrumental. It's practical.
A strategy, like his analogy of the athlete avoiding distractions.
Exactly like that. It's not about being good. It's about efficient energy management. The philosopher's main drive is intellectual work. Ascetic practices act as a dominating instinct that ruthlessly clears the decks, conserves energy, and focuses all resources on the work in progress, thinking, writing, understanding.
So asceticism was just a tool for the philosopher's toolbox. But why did they need it as a precondition for existence? Why the need for camouflage?
Because for most of history, the philosophical spirit itself, the spirit of doubt, relentless questioning, challenging custom, was deeply threatening to the established moral order. To even survive, let alone thrive, philosophy had to disguise itself.
How?
It often had to wear the monk's habit, appearing as a priest, a wise man, a magician, someone who already had social and moral permission to be contemplative or withdrawn. The ascetic ideal provided the necessary cover story, the protective coloration.
Okay, that brings us right to the edge, the conclusion of the whole genealogy. He connects everything, master-slave, guilt debt, the pervasive ascetic ideal to the modern world, specifically to science and the will to truth. This feels like the final twist.
It's the ultimate paradox, because who are the people today who think they're the biggest opponents of the ascetic ideal?
Scientists, atheists, the free spirits he talks about, people who champion reason over faith.
Exactly. The pale atheists, the last idealists of knowledge. They fight dogma, superstition, sin. They believe in facts, evidence, rigorous honesty.
They seem like the polar opposite of the ascetic priest.
But Nietzsche pulls the rug out from under them. He argues that their unconditional will to truth, their absolute commitment to finding truth at any cost, valuing honesty above comfort, above illusion, above perhaps even life itself, is the ascetic ideal.
How can the will to truth be the ascetic ideal?
It's the ideal in its strictest, most spiritual formulation. It's very kernel. What does the ascetic ideal demand, fundamentally? Rejecting illusion, falsehood, the merely comforting, striving for what is real or true, even if it's painful.
Okay, I see the parallel. Honesty above all else.
And Christian morality, he argues, was the great historical training ground for this absolute truthfulness. God is truth, thou shalt not lie. But the irony of the catastrophe is that this very discipline of truthfulness, honed over centuries, eventually turned on Christianity itself.
Also,
When that relentless drive for truth expressed through science, history, philology, was applied rigorously to Christian doctrines, to its historical claims, to its texts, it destroyed the belief system that fostered it. The belief in God, in the metaphysical world, couldn't withstand the scrutiny it itself had championed.
truthfulness killed God. The morality self-destructed.
That's the catastrophe of truthfulness. And the result, nihilism. Modern atheists, he feels, have only been freed from the old errors, God, free will, cosmic purpose, but they haven't been freed for anything new.
So they're left in a vacuum.
Either they believe in nothing, adrift in meaninglessness, or they just double down on the one value left standing, the absolute, unquestioned value of truth itself. They cling to the will to truth without ever asking, wait, why is truth so valuable? Is it always life-enhancing?
It's like trading one faith for another. Faith in God replaced by faith in truth with a capital T.
That's exactly it. He sees unconditional, honest atheism as just one of the last phases of the ascetic ideal, its logical endpoint. Once you reject the Christian interpretation of existence, the discipline of truthfulness hits you with the brutal question, does life mean anything at all? These modern free spirits think they're forward-looking, but they're still driven by the core demand of that ancient ideal, honesty, truth, above life's needs.
So if everything, our morals, our guilt, even our science, is tangled up in this life-denying ascetic ideal, where do we go? Is there a way out? What's the alternative, the counter-ideal that can actually affirm life?
Well, this is where Nietzsche points towards the future, towards Zarathustra. He talks about the law of necessary self-overcoming inherent in life itself. All great things eventually destroy themselves to become something else.
Okay.
He personally commits to what he calls the supreme affirmation, a radical yes to life, embracing everything, even the suffering, the guilt, the ugliness revealed by this whole genealogy. And this yes has to be secured by the very truth and knowledge that seems to have led us to nihilism.
Using truth to overcome the nihilism caused by truth.
It's a high-wire act. He argues the ascetic ideal dominated for so long simply because it was the only ideal on offer. There was no powerful counter-ideal available to fill the void left by God's death until the advent of Zarathustra.
So he's calling for new values, a new direction, forged by someone strong enough to affirm life completely.
Yes, a new kind of philosopher, a creator of values who can stare into the abyss opened up by the will to truth and not flinch, but actually affirm it all. Sickness, struggle, everything. This new path has to start by questioning the absolute value of truth itself. If truth leads to despair, do we choose truth or life? That's the dilemma.
We had a goal, even a sick one, for millennia. Now maybe we have none.
And that void is terrifying. Which leads us to the final, maybe the most profound takeaway from the entire genealogy. The one constant human drive Nietzsche uncovered beneath all the layers, the cruelty, the guilt, the self-denial, the search for truth. The reason the ascetic ideal worked.
Okay.
It's the drive that leaves us with this really provocative thought to chew on. Despite all the pain, the sickness, the apparent meaninglessness, man still prefers to will nothingness than not will.
We'd rather have any goal, even self-destruction, than have no goal at all.
That's the deep, perhaps tragic truth of the human will he leaves us with.